So we'll get right into it. All right, so lessons from current and former admissions readers. So who's the current and who's the former? Hopefully we're able to gather that from our introductions. But I am no longer actively reading college applications. I do read many a college essay guide students applications because we do have one-on-one services that we provide. Both Susan and myself help with that team. So whether it's one-on-one essay coaching or college counseling more broadly, which we have a great team of college counselors to help students with all aspects of the process. I do a lot of reviewing of student applications through our what's called our topic check and our almost done process. So even though I'm not reading applications actively for a college now, I'm still reading a lot of student work really consistently almost every day. So definitely seeing a lot of different new trends and of course things that are emerging for today's students are even different than the students from 2 or 3 years ago when I was actively reading applications. But luckily, Susan is here, who is actively living and breathing that life in addition to many different things as a current adjunct is it adjunct reader, part-time reader?
Oh, there's so many adjectives,
outside.
Temporary, not non-contracted. And for any of you counselors out there who didn't come to your counseling work through college admissions, it's a fabulous education. It's a extraordinary, it adds extraordinary value to your counseling work with students. And it's something that's a little tough to add to a full-time job, as we all know, but I encourage it. There are often positions out there as applicant pools have exploded, and this is how colleges are dealing with that additional volume. So happy to talk about that at another time.
Sure. Yeah. And I mean, so something that Susan and I, prior to doing this session, we actually have spent many hours together recording a 2-part podcast that has yet to debut. It's still in the editing phases, but it's all about choosing our high school classes and helping infuse or communicate your intellectual curiosities as a student into your college application. So as we kind of did that, we started to kind of really start to point out some common things that we lamented, that we were like, oh, we wish, we saw more of these in applications, or we wish that students felt more comfortable and more empowered to talk about some of these things that we really lighted up seeing and still light up seeing as readers for Susan, but just don't see as often in the process. And just common things that we would see that we wish students would take more advantage of certain opportunities and spaces in the application. So that's kind of really what we wanted this session to be mostly centered around, are some of those core lessons or things that we think most students and families should know, especially if they are considering those more selective colleges. So we have kind of 5 key questions that we're going to be divvying up through the presentation today. And then we do want to leave a lot of room for questions that you may have that are more specific to your experience. So Ethan and Jasmine, our wonderful CEG moderator off camera, who is currently going through a move. So Jasmine, shout out to you for just being the real MVP, are going to be keeping an eye out on the Zoom chat to pull questions. So that way Susan and myself and Ethan at the end can really try to get into as many of those as we have time for. But before we do that, one thing that Susan and I really kind of wanted to help distinguish a little bit is the difference between, and some people in the admissions and college counseling space use different language for this. One that's familiar to many people who might be in the audience is Jeff Selingo. He has an awesome book called Who Gets In and Why. And he refers to this general kind of distinction between schools as buyers and sellers. Today, we're kind of referring to them as selective versus rejective colleges, just to kind of really underscore how there are schools, we understand that many students and families are interested in a school that people will recognize and you can have a great sweatshirt or bumper sticker on. And of course, we are not proponents of that being the end all be all. There are, 4,000 plus amazing 4-year US colleges out there that students, we really encourage them to explore and identify. But we also understand the other side of the coin of wanting to have the work that you put in through high school be recognized by a place where people are aware of that level of achievement. So in general, I would say that kind of 2 categories of school that kind of meet that desire and that kind of pull for many students and families of a school that kind of has that level of caliber and recognition for producing brilliant minds and great success and outcomes are those selective schools, which for sake of simplicity, even though there's a lot of nuance here that we can dig into, usually admit around, let's say around 25 to 50% of their applicants versus rejective schools. So selective schools, both Susan and myself have had experience working at institutions like this, where you have an applicant pool where you still are not able to admit the full amount of students who are qualified to attend, but you generally are able to kind of advocate for kids that you like and have just a generally kind of like positive and engaged presence in their application. And especially if they're demonstrating interest at the school, they oftentimes, many of those schools, so for me, that was at Holy Cross, right? So at the time I was working there, the admit rate was around 36%. I believe this year it just dipped to about 21% because of a lot of different initiatives and just, of course, the landscape that we're living in today with these surges in applications for many different reasons. But at Holy Cross, it was really one of those things where for a student who, and there was a lot of nuance to this in terms of like, it was tougher for students who are a little more local versus ones who are further away, which we call geog kids, to be admitted. But in general, if they were taking advantage of a handful of their own high schools, challenging advanced placement or IB courses or whatever advanced level of rigor they had, they were involved in school, maybe they were participating in a sport, drama, maybe some kind of academic activity, and then put in an application that showed a decent amount of effort and coherence, and I could read it. And if a student interviewed or visited campus or had an email exchange with an admissions officer, it was generally giving me enough material as a reader to move them forward in the process and try to give them a shake in committee. So Susan, I don't know if you wanted to add kind of anything about this slide of like this kind of like range of schools where they are selective schools and that they're not just admitting anyone who has a pulse, but there are actionable things that students can do to improve their chances at this kind of, I'd say, range of schools.
Right. These are schools that while they are very selective, they are still looking for students with a lot of potential, where they are not already presenting credentials that look like they are, PhD ready. And there's, some leeway in giving kid some credit for the trajectory and upward trend in grades and things that we as college counselors know are incredibly important about kids' futures and continued growth, in college. Schools that are admitting 25 to 50% are still very selective when you think of the number of students who are getting in because of institutional priorities and hooks. The good news at these schools is there's still a whole chunk of seats left at the college once those other people are admitted. And at the highly rejective schools, it's a minuscule number are left after kids who meet institutional priorities are admitted. So I think that's a big difference for me, is kind of the percentage of seats that go to kids who don't have identifiable hooks or an IP that is a match.
Yeah. So I would say, one of the biggest lessons here for this slide and just this talking point in general is that demonstrating interest piece, which if you're not familiar with that term before, we will explain it. Basically, it's any way that you have a documented point of contact with a college. So unfortunately, talking to an amazing alumni or a friend of a family who attended the school, as long as if the admissions office is not aware of that conversation taking place or doesn't have any record of that, you're essentially not getting, for lack of a better term, credit for how you've explored that particular school. Or the same thing if you're like scrolling on it on social media, or you follow the account, or you watch through Instagram stories of a student's day in the life or YouTube videos. Those are things that as a student, you need to let the college know that those are ways that you've explored it and showed your interest in it. And it's also great to take advantage of virtual tours, emailing your regional admissions officer, doing an interview if they have them available, especially at this range of schools. Interviews, if they're offered, tend to be things that, especially for students who are probably more local to that state and region, usually a general rule of thumb is that the closer you are to a school, the more people are aware of it and, the higher the application volume. So just because of that commonality that is of no fault of your own, you're going to want to make sure that you are distinguishing yourself from, for Holy Cross's sake, I was another kid from Massachusetts, right? So luckily I interviewed and I kind of knew to do some of these things because I read that and they told me, in their information sessions, these were things that would give me a competitive edge in Holy Cross's particular process. So I'd say for this range of schools, and I'd say for any of the schools that are on your list in general, demonstrating interest does not hurt students in any way. And even at highly rejective schools where I spent the bulk of my admissions career, I still had documented touch points with students that like while we did not measure demonstrated interest and it was not something that was a part of our admissions rubric or evaluation of students, it didn't come up in committee. I would see files of kids that I knew from college fairs or visiting their high school, or I had some like really great touch point with them that showed their intellectual curiosity full force. I was more likely to want to try and get those students in if I could make away with an institutional priority argument, then I would do it. So demonstrating interest, I'd say, is one of the most straightforward ways that students can give themselves an edge in this process, no matter what school you're applying to.
The thing that people have to be careful of, though, Tom, is that different colleges look at demonstrated interest very differently, very differently. One institution I've read for only looks at campus visits. And that can be in person or virtual, but that's what they've landed on. And so they say that DI is considered, if you look at the common data set, which is the source for this information, if a counselor or a family is looking for the information. There's that chart on section C, number 7 on the common data set. Every college will give you that grid of influences in the admission process. And the very bottom of the chart, under the non-academic factors, is level of a student's interest. But it is not measured the same way. You know, if an interview is offered by a college, it's a must. It's not to be passed up. They're optional, perhaps, but that's for every college. They even lift that out of demonstrated interest. That's actually a factor in the admissions process. It's not just DI. Checking a box saying, "Up, did that." There's more to that. Another institution I read applications for, when I was a first reader, I could click on a box in Slate and I could see every website hit, the date of every hit. I could see every email and whether or not it was opened. Now, I can also say that there wasn't a lot of influence to that, but what we would pull out of that history of contact were the significant factors, such as a campus visit, correspondence with an admissions counselor, a faculty note where the student had reached out to a faculty member and the faculty member had told admissions that there had been a positive contact. So you know, whether or not a kid follows a college on social media may or may not, and that's on that laundry list of DI, you know, that everybody uses, may or may not ever be noticed. But often, you know, you just have to go by your intuition with that and pay attention to the things that as adults we probably know in building a relationship are significant throughout our careers. Same thing.
Totally. Yeah. So yeah, demonstrated interest in general definitely is something that, like, regardless of how you do it, I'd say general rule of thumb is just make sure it's documented and the admissions office is aware of it, and just take advantage of the opportunities that they allow for you to engage with.
So Tom, what if you visit a college on a day when the admissions office isn't open?
Send an email to your regional rep and be like, "Hey, I had a lovely self-guided tour. I really love this particular building. We stopped for coffee at the campus coffee shop. Bummer I wasn't able to see you all there, but hopefully I can make it there as an admitted student." Smile. Perfect way to kind of sprinkle in a little bit of optimism and positivity around your touch point with campus. Yeah. So flipping kind of to a little more down the selectivity train, road, whatever scale you want to use, a lot of focus and attention, both in the media and with lots of students and families, are on those highly rejective colleges. And something that is a big part of the applying to highly selective schools. It's a 3-part course. So this webinar is infusing a little bit of insights from that course, but if you are interested in this topic and you want to definitely have yourself be as competitive as possible for that, we'll definitely share the info on how to register for that class, because it's 3 different sections, really digging into all the different components of the application and into why schools are so competitive right now. But in general, rule of thumb, just for the sake of simplicity with this slide, these schools where the admit rate is going to be, you know, honestly, sometimes less than 30%, definitely less than 25%. It's the admit rate is just, you know, the admit rate that's posted is not your admit rate, is another kind of wisdom in admissions, because every individual student, depending on what they're bringing to the table and the applicant pool that they're a part of, are going to automatically have certain things that are more common about their profile and demographics. If they're from the state, like I kind of mentioned before, if they're from the state where the college is in, there's generally a higher proportion of applicants from that area. So the college is interested in having students from all different corners of the world. I actually just went to a campus visit at University of Maine this past week, and he was talking all about how Maine is a state where the population is declining a lot. So they're wanting to have more out-of-state students, and that's really something that they're really pushing to try and have more and more of those students be a part of UMaine's campus. So, you know, this is a term, what I just described to you, as something that an enrollment leader at a college is tasked with from, in his case, it's the governor. So most colleges, it's the president. He's literally getting directives from the actual whole leader of the state, right? But that type of, I guess, charging and marching orders that a school has to navigate to complete their admission process is called institutional priorities. We have a slide coming up that kind of unpacks a little bit of what these may be. But if you are focusing on these schools or adding these to your list that are in this kind of echelon of selectivity, it's really important to understand and recognize that institutional priorities are happening as part of the admissions committee conversation and the reading process that the admissions team is asked and tasked by their leadership to keep in mind when admitting students. So they're not just admitting the kid who's, you know, generally active in their school and has taken a few advanced classes and done well in them and visited the school. Those students are the vast majority of the applicant pool, generally about over 80% for most of these colleges. So some of the things that you see here on this slide are going to be things that admissions officers at these particular schools are really keeping in mind when they're making their decision process. And in terms of my key strategies for this, I actually really struggled to kind of put a bullet for that last point. But for the sake of, you know, equality from the previous slide to this one, I was like, okay, my biggest piece of advice is if this is something that's really important to you in your process and you want to be admitted to one of these schools, I would say thinking about schools where you have some kind of anomalous part of what you're bringing to the table is, for lack of a better term, a strategy that could not will could potentially give you a slightly more competitive edge in their process. So an example of this that I bring up a lot is I used to work at a school in Seattle, right? And all the kids would tell me, they're like, I'm really open to geography, but basically I want somewhere in California or Washington or the Northeast and nowhere else in between. And I'm like, okay, sounds like you're really open to geography.
As long as it's in Boston.
Right, literally, right? So that I think is just something that, for example, when I started working in college counseling, so many amazing schools in the Midwest, right? And especially some of the Rust Belt states, just traditionally, there's a lot of amazing educational institutions there, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, that many of them are highly selective schools. People are familiar with them. You know, they have a lot to offer. But as a student from some of these other areas, you are simply getting a slight bump in their process just by being what is considered a geography kid. You're coming from a state that is less commonly seen in their applicant pool. And adding schools to that in the mix with maybe some of the schools in those more popular states or regions that many students are flocking to. So currently the trend for that tends to be urban centers, kind of mid-sized to larger institutions. That is culturally right now what many students are really gravitating towards. So I'd say just thinking about kind of just the market demand and places where people are latching onto and the parts of kind of your profile that you're sending into these colleges that at some schools is going to appear very common just from a real, you know, ballpark bird's eye view of your application, not digging deep into the nuance of it. Just being mindful of that. And I'd say putting together a college list that really kind of thinks about that in a strategic way. Susan, anything to add on this slide?
You know, the thing that jumps out at me, Tom, is you can't fake what you can't fake this slide. You know, and where you say identifying schools where your profile is more anomalous, I really get that. It's a way to stand out and be in a smaller subset of an applicant pool, but it's got to be authentically you. The thing is that would be true when I talk to a student who might say, well, I really want to be an art history major, but it's so uncool. You know, and everyone will make fun of me. And I'm like, so I'm going to apply as a STEM student instead, you know, because that's very cool. Kids will shoot themselves in the foot like that, and they also are being disingenuous. They're not only misunderstanding the process, but they don't understand that this is a time in their life where they have to go for what they want, but they can't also set artificial limits.
Yep.
As in, I want to stay in California, but I would go to Boston.
Right.
And what they're really saying is I would go to one of 4 colleges in Boston. Right. So they're something we as counselors have to do is kind of peel away the layers a little bit and find out where are these priorities that families are coming up with early in the process, and try and open some of those windows to allow some air in those areas.
Totally. Yeah. I mean, I think one of my biggest college counseling mantras is there are institutional priorities that are out there that are out of your control and happening behind the scenes. And most schools are not, we have a slide about this, but most schools are not super forward about these priorities because they're concerned about people gaming the system and crafting inauthentic applications, right? So all the things that you see here listed on the screen are things that many admissions officers at these highly rejective colleges are going to be tasked by their school leadership to consider when they're bringing forward students in the review and committee process. And at some schools, some of these things are more heavy-handed than others. There's a lot happening right now in the higher education landscape related to Supreme Court decisions and pressure from lots of different parties at play to modify existing admissions practices, for example, legacy students, right? Many colleges are starting to announce that they are revisiting and rethinking those policies as a form of equity, right? So all these things to plan a high school life, basically to bank on some of these things being a part of your process, as we've seen very recently, is something that you really cannot predict what the landscape's going to look like in 4 years. Things shift very, very quickly and dramatically. So that's, I think, just one piece of advice that we, always put out there as college counselors, is trying to kind of search for the hook. And we have an amazing blog written by one Susan Tree, all about hooks and institutional priorities that we can put in the chat and share with you all in the post email follow-up. But really kind of digging deep into the nuance behind some of these terms here. For the sake of time, we're not going to go so deeply into all these because we want to get you all the goods in this webinar. But just, one thing that I kind of want to point out is, and I kind of just, summarize this a little bit, but this is something that those things that you see on the screen, if you're seeing them and you're like, I don't have any of those things, I don't know how I'm going to get into college, right? I'm really only talking about the literal 2% of US colleges that have those highly rejective admit rates, right? They do not represent the majority of educational systems out there. And there was actually a great piece just that one of our colleagues at College SEI shared with us on Slack today about public flagship institutions that are very well known. And if you wear the sweatshirt and you have the water bottle and everything, people are going to stop you in airports and be like, oh my God, I'm a cougar, or whatever it is, right? That everyone's familiar with, everyone's really excited about, but don't have these single digit admit rates. So I think just something to really keep in mind is that a balanced list is something that probably every college counselor drills home over and over again. And something that Susan and I were talking about just before this webinar is the common trend right now for many students to do what's called shotgunning. So Susan, I don't know if you wanted to kind of touch a little bit on this, the kind of chance me category of I'm just going to apply to as many of these highly rejected schools as possible and hope that the probability and statistics and math works out in my favor at maybe one of them. Any thoughts on that strategy as a current reader and seasoned veteran?
Well, what's interesting is that it's not really if I apply to more, my chances of getting into any of them goes up. I do understand that students hear stories, and a lot of them are true, that, well, my neighbor's son got into Harvard, but didn't get into Duke, or, my friend got into, Tufts, but didn't get into UVA, so there is in pretty much everyone's minds this linear, this college is more selective than this college is more selective than this college. And a lot of families will look at acceptance percentages as a gross figure and figure that dictates not only the quality of the education, which couldn't be farther from the truth, but the chances of getting in. And actually, your chances improve if you are able in your application to demonstrate why a college is a well-researched fit for your academic goals, which could be undecided, by the way, that's a noble goal to have, that's why you're going to college, to figure that out. And for the community in which that supports the college experience. Colleges are going to evaluate academics, they're going to evaluate personal gifts and qualities, and they're going to evaluate fit, or whatever they choose to call that particularly dimension. Fit has a lot to do with how you as an applicant can identify in your application why you are an excellent academic and personal fit. Now, you have to already have gotten through that first round of elimination, right, Tom, that you referred to, when about, on average, about 20% at a selective school, about 20% of the students are limited on the basis of not having competitive academic credentials. Although some of them stay in because they may be viewed as high talent cases or whatever, but the college has faith that maybe they can be successful. It depends a lot on the individual circumstances, but we see that happening sometimes with high talent students. But if you write basically the same application for a group of highly rejective colleges, it's not going to increase your chances. You've got to write a very different application, particularly the parts of the application customized for that institution. Right? The Common App is, I used to say 50-50, 50% common, 50% institution specific. The weight, however, the work may be 50-50, but the weight is, highly selective schools is definitely slanted toward the supplement.
Yes.
Because of the information that the college gets there about looking at you through their lens, and you looking at them through that lens. But all that becomes important after you have kind of made it through the first rounds of elimination.
Yeah.
And made it to that level where everybody left in the pool is pretty much well qualified, and the college can start shaping the class, with their buckets, their buckets of institutional priorities, and see how things go.
Yeah. And something that I feel like in my conversations with students and families, not as many families are aware of this, but there is at many of these highly selective schools, there's a big emphasis on non-cognitive evaluation of students and actually rating in an imperfect way, admittedly, right? It's a application that readers are going through very, very quickly based on the volume that they have. But there are sometimes valued qualities actually that the admissions team, particularly for the supplemental essays that they as an admissions office and a college have created. Sometimes boards are actually really involved in putting together those questions. So I actually was talking recently with a colleague of mine at Claremont McKenna College. It was so fascinating to me to kind of hear, even in the Claremont Consortium, the Claremont colleges, all right next to each other in 1 square mile, such a different institutional culture from school to school. And she was talking about how the board is actually very actively involved in choosing and putting together these supplemental essay questions that they believe, as the kind of largest body and judicial entity, I guess you could say, at that school, are the most important things that they want to sustain the future of the college. So every college is going to approach putting together those supplemental questions differently, but definitely one lesson that hopefully you're taking away from this session here is the shotgunning approach can be appealing, I guess, from a pure, let me just cast out what I have to offer and see who buys what I'm selling. Just knowing that you need to make a very customized sales pitch for every single one of those schools that you add into your shop.
And Tom, to your second point on this slide, where you say the majority of these institutional priorities are not public knowledge, there's some that are. Mm-hmm. And if you don't notice them as an applicant, well, first of all, you're not doing due diligence in terms of your research, because these may well be the truly distinguishing features of a university, but they are explained in the college's mission statement, mm-hmm. on the website, in their strategic plan, both mission state, well, history, mission statement, and strategic plan are generally published, not on the admissions website, but somewhere on the college's larger website. And that's where you can read how colleges choose to describe themselves. And one exercise I do with the juniors or rising seniors that I work with is for each college on their list, they have to go to the mission statement and write down the adjectives that the colleges that a college uses to describe itself. Now, some of them are going to be pretty rigorous, diverse, this, but then they'll start seeing how colleges describe themselves a little differently. Some of these are rooted in their historic underpinnings, but also in the strategic plans that the boards are coming up with that have to be implemented through the admission process. Then after kids do that, they should go to the admissions website and look at the mission statement and admissions won't call it that, but the preamble to everything they say about their admission process will basically tell you what is guiding them in the recruitment and evaluation of students. And they give a lot away. And excuse me, if students don't notice that, then they are running the risk of coming across as awfully generic because they won't be speaking to that perspective in their application.
Yeah, great tip. Seriously. I actually used to do an exercise with like all the Claremont colleges mission statements and different supplemental essay examples to pull out, even in the same consortium, they're all small liberal arts colleges, right? They all only, educate undergraduate students other than Claremont Graduate University. But you really kind of get to notice those distinctions from school to school based on those foundational documents or what they're called. Yeah. So for the sake of time, we're going to go quickly through this one here. But one big question that we get a lot, or that we think you all as people going and embarking on this process should be aware of, is the current pressure right now on admissions offices related to academic interest. So in today's landscape, in comparison to the past, 50 or so years in the US culture, the American college experience is very uniquely American. It's very much has been for, the longest time, really rooted in educating the whole person, right? So liberal arts is an education in the art of liberty. Is something that a former Pomona professor said at a convocation many years back. And basically the art of liberty is the art of freedom, right? So freedom to dabble and explore different classes, different interests, to see kind of what lands for you, because as a developing 17 and 18-year-old, many times you have a vision and idea of kind of what your superpower is and what you're great at and what subjects in school you really enjoy. But not as many students have had that deep exposure in a particular profession as you might suggest, or as it might seem based on the way that that's driving many students' process right now in 2023. So because of a lot of different factors, right? Emphasis on return on investment and the rising cost of higher education, there is a lot of pressure on students and families to choose programs and majors and potential career paths that are going to be correlated with financial stability, employability, things along those lines. So in response to kind of this shifting landscape in the US and just this, all those factors, big emphasis and uptick on majors such as computer science, business and economics, engineering, nursing, psychology, and depending on an individual college, if basically anytime a school has a ranking on niche or US News or anything, and it's most popular majors, top majors, you should be aware, especially if it's a highly rejective college, that everyone else and their mother is also doing the same thing. What are the best schools for insert academic area? This is one of the biggest tips that I can give you in lessons as an admissions reader, is to not fall prey to that. And I actually want to share with you a quick anecdote from most recently, Ethan, my wonderful colleague, Hannah Lim, our director of workshops, and myself attended a admissions conference in Spokane, Washington. Lovely Gonzaga University was right down the street, so go Zags. And one of the sessions that I attended was a panel of all these different admissions officers from different highly selective schools. And one of them was like, she said, at my former institution that I worked at, it's a school in Chicago, I'm not going to mention the name because she said not to. We had the top major was economics. And it was, anytime you search best schools for economics, we were always in the top. And we had a flood of kids who wanted that program, and we just could not admit all those kids who were showing, even though they had deep interest in it, they had done a research project, internship, that was something that kind of left them, for lack of a better term, like dead in the water right from the beginning, unless they were kind of making up for that with other hard-pressed institutional priorities that the school was looking for. So basically, even though they were econ, they were bringing these other things to the table, so they were admitted, right? That's a lot of times, that's actually how it works for some of these really highly impacted majors at some of these rejective schools. But what she said, though, was the Nobel Prize winning team on the most recent, economics project is from my former school in Chicago and my current school in St. Louis. And our program is pretty darn great, if you ask me, but we're not kind of listed as the top 10 economics program, but our school in general, anyone who goes there, no matter what these programs are, is going to get a great and amazing education. So all that to say, I think one big question to ask yourself, if you are interested in some of these really big in-demand majors and programs, is what is really motivating your process right now? And ask yourself this honestly. Is it the program that I want, or a place that I want to call and say that I attend insert college, right? Because you can't always have your cake and eat it too, especially for some of these more competitive programs. So I just really want to caution any students and families who are leaning towards those, just to be aware that one thing that many schools are doing now, which, we're big fans of the transparency of University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. Shout out to Andy Borsch. He's an amazing leader there who has been really great about sharing a lot of data around the challenges that they're facing from an enrollment management perspective and a supply and demand perspective from their student body, and trying to meet the needs of their faculty and their board and their president and all those things, right? So they've done a great job of highlighting majors and programs for students who are like, hey, I know I like coding and CS, and I want to work in Silicon Valley, and that's the future, right? Understandably, that's going to be where a lot of students kind of gravitate towards. But I'd say kind of encouraging students to keep an open mind with some of these alternate majors that, say a school allows you to put down your first and second choice academic interest. You're doing yourself a disservice if you're not identifying a second interest beyond the most highly selective programs, because a lot of times kids who don't do that will just be denied to the college outright and not even admitted to an alternate program or major or have a fighting chance. So UIUC right here is doing a great job of kind of highlighting, for students who are interested in computers in general, here are some things that you may have not heard of before, because computer science is like the shorthand for the general umbrella of all these academic disciplines. But let's tell you about some of these really cool, unique, specific programs that we have that will still allow you to gain that amazing salary you want and, a lucrative employment career and be a competitive person in this world, but in a slightly different way and with a very different admit rate. So anything to add on this, Susan?
Well, I think that teenagers in general they may be naming a major because it makes a good impression. It gets people off your back at home when you say, I want to study business, or I want to study something that's kind of trendy and lucrative. I understand that. And if you're good at math, you can say all sorts of things, and it's going to matter. When an admission person reads your application, they're going to look for evidence that you understand what the major entails. And that's really clear in a lot of applications. There are kids who from 9th grade have been in, Project Lead the Way engineering, or they've been at STEM magnet schools, or even if they haven't, they've reached out for experiences and coursework even beyond their school, what their school offers, in order to learn about these fields of study, and they know what they're talking about in their application, and that's quite clear. It also, sincerity in a major can be very evident in extracurricular activities. How is the student chosen to use her discretionary time in high school? Not that high school kids have much of what they would consider to be discretionary time, but the time that they have control over to experience, whether it's the literary magazine for the student who's looking into journalism, or the robotics champion who's headed for mechanical engineering. There can be an alignment between the coursework the student has taken, that makes sense to prepare for that field of study, and the the extracurricular use of time. And that's really influential. That can really elevate an application where you realize you're dealing with a student who's looking at a limited or incredibly popular major, which can even be in a liberal arts college. This isn't just about applying to, Wharton School of Business or University of Illinois to computer science. It could be at a liberal arts college where there's kind of a pileup of kids in, economics, psychology, neuroscience. And it's not necessarily professional programs. But as we work with students, we have to talk them through that sense of what does alignment mean. It's if you were arguing your application in front of a jury, if you think about it, you're in a court of law, you're arguing your case in front of a jury. What persuasive evidence would you bring to convince that jury that, of a particular understanding of a field of study? And as I said earlier, don't fake it, because being undecided is fine. It's not only fine, it's great. But you, just like for a major field, you have to have a defense for it. Yeah. And kids love the I'm a lawyer in front of a jury, and but that's a kind of a metaphor that can work when you're talking to your own children or to kids that you counsel. Get them thinking about it that way.
Yeah. So another thing that we wanted to touch on as well is, what do admissions officers see too much of and not enough of from applicants? And again, these are kind of like, just us lamenting, from reading applications, some of these different things. But something that I noticed, particularly myself and my colleague Hannah, we read a lot of applications from a school in India this year. Amazing school. The kids were so incredible, so talented. They were, pulling together accolades and the top 1% of insert, talent in this area, chess or whatever it is, left and right. And in a way, it actually kind of became so overwhelming in the way that they were presenting it, that my advice to the team was basically like, I think you need to actually tell your kids to kind of scale it back a little bit, because the approach that I feel like they're kind of latching onto is that I'm just going to throw as many impressive things to out impress other kids in the pool that I can. And I think something just to really think about is proving how much more you are than other kids is actually something that is a wasted effort, in my opinion, because you're already kind of, by like being in these application pools and achieving the academic credentials that you have and being involved in the things that you're excited about, that is enough when it comes to being a viable competitive candidate. These other priorities that are happening behind the scenes may not be in alignment with what you're bringing to the table. And that's something that you may not ever know about. But just adding on more and more to your candidacy, or trying to cram in as many things and this and that. Remember, people are reading these in like 10 minutes or less oftentimes at these schools. So they're not going to be able to dive so deeply into every research excerpt and this and that you may be sending in. So I think just to kind of scale back a little bit of kind of like let me just pile on as many things and hope that something I'm mentioning catches someone's eye approach. It's usually kind of some of the things we're going to mention on the next slide that actually do tip the needle for students a little more so, and attract the reader who, again, they're seeing these applications. Think about the math of this, right? For 2 or 3 months, you're reading 60 to 70. This for me, I was reading 60 to 70 applications a day. I believe, Susan, you said it was around like 30 to 40, your current role.
40 was the goal.
40 or so. Yeah. So either way, whether it's 40 or 70, you're still reading a whole lot of different candidacies, and you're seeing a lot of similar things, especially when it comes to achievement culture, showing that you're the most hardworking, the best, the strongest, the fastest, the smartest. And you already kind of generally have communicated that narrative with a lot of things in your application. That kind of just drilling that point over and over and over again is not actually really enhancing your candidacy. It's just telling the admissions officer what they already can tell from your transcript, from your recommendations, from the activities, just by what they are. So instead, something that we kind of wanted to leave you with in terms of practical and actionable advice to think about in your application, or to encourage your student to think about, are using a few different spaces, I'd say pretty strategically. So one of them, of course, is we talked a lot about demonstrating interest. So we got that covered. But I'd say just in general, and I have a slide kind of about this that we can show, but something that Susan and I talked a lot about is a strategic use of the additional information section. So Susan, do you want to kind of maybe mention where you think that could show value to a student's candidacy, or maybe where it's not being utilized as effectively?
Well, and I'll keep it short because I know we want to get to some questions, but there are students who are minimalists with the application process, where they don't want to do anything that's optional for fear of making a misstep, or just simply not wanting to do it. They feel they've said what they need to say. Sometimes that's fine, but sometimes when I read an application, I'm left thinking that I don't really know this student, that there's more to the story. There's stuff on the transcript that should have been explained about the choice of courses, or a bad grade or bad semester at some point. And kids sometimes think that if they don't call attention to something, admissions people won't notice it in the application. But readers really do notice. We've got antennae all over the place, and we tend to have good intuition when we're reading an application to know when we're getting either a very superficial treatment or things are gapped. They're just simply gaps all over the place. It's very hard to admit a student like that, because if there's not a good reason for it, if we don't think whatever, it's hard. There are also students who are kind of overachievers in the application process, and they cram every corner of the application to the max. Sometimes the information is incredibly valuable, and the additional information section can be a place where students unpack odd things, whether it's an activity that merits more of an explanation, or a family circumstance that created a distraction. Use that community disruption statement to explain what distracted you from your normal academic journey. Use additional information to introduce information that isn't captured elsewhere. Every piece of your application needs to add value. An admissions dean once said it, you got all this information, and somewhere you have to have a lens that brings it into focus. So you can't think about the application as just a, disparate group of pieces. They've got to hang together, because while each piece is evaluated and rated and contributes to a rating in some way by the admissions reader, the overall congruity and message that your application gives is really, really important. So you have to kind of step back throughout the process of writing your application and say, what's the value added of this piece? What's the value? Or am I just blabbing here, or am I hiding something? Where's the value?
Yeah. And for the sake of time, I'm going to go through these really quickly, so I apologize, but I'm happy to stay on later with folks with some of these questions that came in. So just know that if you have questions and you're like, well, I want to know more, I'm happy to stay on for a few minutes afterwards. Can't speak for Susan or Ethan or anyone else, but that's fine with me. I did want to kind of briefly mention this slide, because if you're seeing it, you're probably like, does this mean that the things on the left are bad because they're expected? No. What I'm saying here is that a lot of times students kind of like really harp and push a lot of these. We're really big at college essay on identifying your core values. We think that's really, really important in terms of being able to share your story in a way that you're providing information about your skills, qualities, values, and interest that the admissions officer reading your application might not know as much about from the other components of your app. So from your transcript, from your recommendations, from your activities list. Oftentimes, a lot of students will try to use their essays, supplemental or personal, as a way to drill home these values that you see here on the left, the expected values. These are ones that students oftentimes, just by growing up and living in a culture where achievement is really prioritized and celebrated, and people really talk a lot about merit and kind of hard work and perseverance and being diligent and task oriented and getting things done and being impressive. And also things that they're like, oh, colleges want people who do service and people who are compassionate and, people who value travel. And yes, that's all well and good. But the things that you're seeing here on the right side, the reason why the values exercise, I think, can be very helpful and something that is a really great part of our coaching practice at CEG is really kind of trying to help students see the value in, unpacking some of these other values that they may be identifying as core to who they are. And they may think like, this doesn't seem collegey, or like, this doesn't seem like a college would care. So one that we kept on here, for example, was I think wealth is one that you see on the right side. You're like, wealth? You shouldn't be saying that your college app. Like, that's nonsense. But actually, I read an incredible essay from a student who talked about how wealth was something that was really driving his force because him and his family didn't have access to it growing up. And he's seen the way that people, he says, in my mind, wealth is power. And I value it because I know that if I was to gain it and to have it be part of my legacy and future generations in my family, I would ideally be the person in place to kind of remove that hoarding of it and really kind of be more altruistic and think about people who didn't have a seat at the table. So sometimes there's more to the story when it comes to a student's value, that the writing samples in an application can be a place to unpack that and expand it. So I'd say these values on the right side are ones that oftentimes don't seem as collegey, but that's exactly the reason why they're good ones to kind of elaborate and expand on in your candidacy, because people in admissions are going to be intrigued about them and not know as much about it from the implied parts of what you're already bringing to the table. We did have a section kind of about like how your high school, plays a role in the process, but the TLDR, as the kids say, the too long didn't read, is basically something that you should really look up if you haven't already, is your school profile. It's a document that admissions offices and admissions officers use to get a sense from the high school that you're coming from and what courses are offered, how many students go on to four-year colleges, things along those lines, to help better contextualize what academic offerings you had and what things that you left on the table that you didn't complete as part of your academic candidacy. So that's definitely something that you should take a look at and have a better understanding of, so that way you know what's being communicated about your school. And if you think that there's things about your experience that aren't as explained in that document, ask your college counselor whether or not they will be providing some of that context or using that additional information section we mentioned before to make that happen. And this is the last slide that we can just leave and not have be a thing. But yeah, we hope that those lessons were helpful in transitioning to Ethan.
Thanks, y'all. Well, I just threw a link into the chat we're going to give a book away in a minute, and we'd love to just learn more about you and what you're interested in for future sessions. So I put that in. It's the Google form. We'll do that in 2 minutes. And I just want to take like 60 seconds to share with you other stuff that's coming up that you can learn about. And we've got, for example, this is just a link, and you'll get links from this in the chat from Jasmine. I'm right now leading a two-part course. We're in the college application supplemental essays. We've got a session happening tomorrow, in fact, and folks can join at any point. These are all pay what you can courses. And we're focusing on the activities list and things like Tom and Susan were talking about the additional information section. That was what we talked about last week. And then we're talking about those Why Us essays, which is another great way to demonstrate interest. Coming up next in like a couple weeks is a course with the amazing Amanda Miller on how to make college affordable. That's coming up the 5th to 12th of August. And then Tom's got an awesome course called Applying to Highly Selective Colleges and Universities that's happening just after that. So we'll put links to these in the chat right now so you can see more on those. As Tom mentioned, we do support students one-on-one through the college essay and admission coaching process, if that's something that you're interested in. And just for the sake of time, Tom, even though we were going to kind of go through this, I think I want to get to Q&A, and we can just follow up with folks with more info on the courses. Does that sound okay?
Totally. Yeah, I saw a lot of great questions coming in as I was dabbling from slides to chat box to document. So yeah, happy to dive in. And Susan, again, if you have to bounce, totally get it. But I'll stay on for as many questions as we can answer and try to give the people what they're looking for.
Lovely. I'll be here for 2 more minutes, and then my wife and daughter are waiting for me to eat dinner. So then I'm going to go.
Oh,
So I will let y'all do the moderating. But you know what? You've got the questions. You've got the behind the scenes here. One of the ones that I wanted to flag, because it's one that I think students wonder about a lot, is the impact of applying undecided on an application. And maybe, I don't know, Susan, I'll lob that one to you. What's your sense? Of course, this is one of those famous "it depends" situations, I'm sure, but what is your sense about? I think what students wonder is like, is it okay to apply undecided? What would you say about that?
it's much better than trying to construct an artificial and kind of case for a particular major. Undecided, you have to have a defense for it. As I mentioned, undecided should mean that you have any number of really legitimate academic interests that you are looking forward to exploring, in your first year or two as you decide, along with a good advisor and a lot of good coursework, what your real degree is going to be in. And that is extremely defensible and is kind of not as common as it was, in some previous generations. A lot of universities have on their websites a real clear description of what it means to be undecided and the value added of being in that situation and the kind of support you're going to receive. So undecided does not mean I have no interests. It actually means I'm picking your college because I have a number of interests that I am so looking forward to exploring. That's why I'm going to college, and your college is a fit for me because of that.
Right.
Yeah.
And finding a way to make that argument in your application essays is really key, especially when they ask you things like, hey, why do you want to go to our college? You don't need to necessarily, even though it can make it easier to be like, I'm interested in mechanical engineering and your school, da, 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 da. You can, if you want, just to get really specific, you can go, I'm so glad to go to your school because I value, one of the things I'll ask is like, what is the thing that you value that is like so awesome and positive that reframes your undecidedness? So a student, for example, a few years ago, once she said, I so value exploration. And, and she used the word exploration. I was like, oh, that is an important value. And she's like, that's why I'm so excited about your school, because you give me the freedom to do that for a couple of years. So
Wow.
what is the value that you're fighting for here?
There's a real difference, Ethan, between kids who have very pressing professional goals and
Right.
those that know they'll have them in the future, but they're not there. I talked with a student the other day who I described as a scholar in the making, that this is a person who isn't always connecting my interest in math with, engineering or something, statistical analysis or data science. They're interested in the beauty of higher level math and what the purposes of that for, in the universe or whatever. I'm gilding the lily there, but those are kids where in admissions, readers will write comments like PhD in this kid's future, scholar in the making. The faculty are going to love to teach this student. So they are a type of student. Now, a lot of kids aren't there yet. They're not intellectually mature yet to be able to speak with that language, but they can talk very much about the excitement they have for looking broadly at a number of different fields of study and then making the decision what they're going to get their degree in when they're ready.
Yeah. My big mantra with this is there's a difference between being undecided and apathetic. Like if you, for example, if a school asks you why'd you choose your academic interest? And you write I didn't really know. I just put this because I haven't thought about it yet or haven't taken the time to do that reflection. And I just want to go to your school. That's again, not going to be a really compelling reason for a school to admit you. I'd say giving a window into what you're thinking about at this point in time doesn't hurt applicants. And in fact, I would say that's the way to kind of approach that undecided question. Because you can very much mention that the reason you're going in undecided is because you're excited about, for example, especially if you're choosing to apply undecided to a liberal arts college, you're excited about dabbling and exploring, and that's what's drawing you to that model of education. It's a perfectly legitimate response. But I'd say mentioning classes or topics or things that you watch Netflix documentaries on or Wikipedia rabbit holes about, or even TikTok, you can get in a real rabbit hole on, TikToks that have a lot of educational value. So whatever kind of your curiosity leans to or topics that you find interesting, fuse that into your response, because even if it doesn't seem schooly enough or academic enough, it gives someone in admissions a way into your mind and what's really drawing your attention, which is something that they're really curious about. Yeah.
I'm going to give away a book and then I'm going to go and be with my family and let y'all take it. The winner of the book is, I just picked somebody at random, Krista Singleton. So Krista, if you're still here, great. We will email you with, you're going to get this college admission essentials book that I wrote. I'm so grateful to y'all for all that you're bringing. So I'm going to slip out. Much love. We'll hand it. Y'all are in very good hands. For the 147 of y'all who are left, much love, and I'll let you handle it from here.
Thanks, Ethan. All right.
Have a good dinner.
Diving into these questions. Let's see. One that we have is, does ED say enough about interest in that school? So early decision. I can take this one real quick. Obviously applying early decision, the implication, so if you haven't heard that term before, it means that you are bound through a contract and chains. I'm kidding, it's not that intense, but I mean, but kind of is. You are basically telling the college that you are committing to attend that school, and you will withdraw your other applications if you are admitted there. So that's what early decision is. It is, I would say right now in the current landscape, if students are able to do that or able to identify an early decision school, it can definitely increase your chances, especially at these more selective schools. But it's not appropriate for every student situation, financially, personally, or otherwise. So don't feel pressured to go the ED route if you're not ready for that. But it definitely is a big recommendation that college counselors will give to students if there's a school that's emerging as a clear front runner and you're competitive academically and from an admissions profile standpoint. In terms of the question of does it show enough of your interest? Yes and no. I mean, I think that it's obviously applying early decision. They expect that you know a lot about the school and you're interested in it, but you still should take advantage of those other opportunities because again, there are going to be at these competitive schools. It's still not like every student who applies ED is admitted, right?
Right.
So really kind of adding more to your, I guess, depth of exploration of the school might be something that does help the person who's evaluating your file give you a little more airtime and kind of try to push for you more in the process than maybe a kid who is, yes, applying ED, but doesn't have any other touch points or ways to mention or kind of ways that they've engaged with the school. So I'd still say, there is an implication there, but it still would recommend demonstrating interest beyond that. And it's funny, there's a Susan here, and I can have Susan take this one. In regard to demonstrated interest in emailing your regional admissions rep, we have generally heard not to email unless you have good questions with answers not found on their website. Would you have examples of questions or legitimate opportunities to email our admissions rep? We do not want to waste their time, but want to make the connection. Great question.
Great question. I think establishing a contact with your admission counselor, who you can generally identify on the admissions website because they're usually assigned geographically. Some universities don't make that information public. You can only email the admissions mailbox, but a lot of them do say, well, here's the representative for, the northern Great Plains states, or here's the representative for, the state of New York or Metro New York City or whatever. But you clearly don't want to do it because you think you're just going to get a brownie point, because you'll just get glanced at and then passed over. It won't be up to them to engage with you in a meaningful way. My students I work with very often will write their admission counselor to say, either like Tom mentioned earlier, that they visited at a time when the admissions office was closed and they wanted to follow up with some questions. Or they might want to see if there is an opportunity to sit in on a virtual class, and perhaps there's nothing listed on the admissions website offering that opportunity, but a student might be saying, I'm really interested in this in geosciences, and I'd love to have a chance to sit in on a virtual class. Another great question to ask is, I have a particular academic interest, and could you refer me to a member of the faculty who might be willing to do an informational interview with me? But you got to know what you're talking about in a way. I'm a prospective French major, and I'm really interested in, women poets of the Romantic, this is getting a little esoteric, but women poets of certain eras in French history. And I see professors who teach in that area, but I imagine some of them are on sabbatical or not that responsive. Could you give me a contact? I think that's an awesome way to do it.
Yeah. And I'd say all the advice that you gave is great. And especially I think of use the admissions officer kind of as a concierge. Because I loved when kids would come to me and be like, hey, I'm interested in these things. Do you have students, that are part of the tour guide staff, or that or, a lot of colleges will have student liaisons for academic departments.
Yeah.
Do you know of anyone who you think might be good for me to continue this conversation with? That's, kind of a way that shows, you're interested in something that, you want to explore more about for the school, and you're trying to go beyond the website. But in general, one big message that I want to put out there that I think is kind of like the subtext of this question is like, we don't want to piss the admissions officers off or like bother them and have them add us to their do not call list. It doesn't work like that. Like, if you send an email that they don't feel like responding to, they might just not respond to it, but it's not actually going to like throw you out of the running of being a competitive candidate or applicant. So I am not a huge proponent. And even like at the school I used to work at, I would kind of push back sometimes on advice around like, well, you don't want to do this because admissions officers don't like it and they're going to be annoyed by it. Like, so be it if they are. Like, I would say there's enough pressure and stress on you in this process to have your cake and eat it too and do all these things. Sending in the email is better than not sending an email at all. So I'd say in general, it's better to send, I'd say, a more thorough email or detailed, or kind of mentioning the things that Susan just kind of put out there. But in general, the fear of sending the message of like how it's going to be received by the other person and if you're going to tick them off, their job is to be a resource to you. So hopefully they're nice and respond and are helpful. But even if they send you back a link to the website, you did your part in sending in the email,
Right.
and it will be recorded as part of your file. So you did your due diligence, right? So I'd say just to kind of take the pressure off yourself for feeling like your email needs to be this like poetic masterpiece, because
Right.
I've seen them all, and some are great and some are just like meh, but they never like impacted a student's process.
Well, and here's a hint for how to write an email to an admission counselor. You briefly introduce yourself, put yourself in context. You know, I understand you are the admission counselor who is the liaison with applicants from Northern New England. Okay, I go to Hanover High School in New Hampshire and am a rising senior. The second thing you say is something you already know. I understand that the university has an unusual undergraduate degree program in animal behavior, theater technology, something where you are saying, I understand, meaning you have already done that level of research. I have some questions about the blah, blah, blah. So introduce yourself, tell them something you already know, and then ask your question. It's a nice way for them to see a flow, and it just makes a lot of sense. You're more likely to get an answer.
Yeah. So a couple of questions came in about the slide on institutional priorities, and one of them was research with faculty member or college level research, basically, with the support or a recommendation from a faculty member. That is, I'd say, a more rare one. So again, like those lists of priorities are not ones that every college is going to really stringently look at and evaluate with a lot of depth. But I'd say, especially for some of those like STEM-based schools where all the applicants are applying to STEM majors. So think about the MITs of the world, the Caltechs of the world, right? Their admissions team, a lot of those schools actually do have faculty more involved in the admissions review process than other liberal arts colleges, other selective universities that are not exclusively centering on STEM. So of course, different to that would be like a Juilliard, which is like one of the most selective schools, but it's all about the arts, right? Especially performing arts. But in general, at a lot of those schools, they've been kind of tasked with, because there are all these STEM rock stars out there, right? We need to like finding the ones who kind of have documented vetting from a college professor, a peer, you know, in academia, who has worked with that student, you know, with what they're working on, especially if the student is coming from a resource background. That's something that a lot of those STEM-based schools, the MITs, the Caltechs, things along those lines, may be considering. So that, again, is a small example of an institutional priority that doesn't impact all the colleges out there, but it yet again proves kind of the variance of priorities from school to school based on their unique culture, the pressures that they're dealing with, and just the way that they go about their process. Another question, Susan, that came in was, if we have a second choice major, should we still put the more impacted major first, or would it benefit us to put it second and would the less competitive one first? Good question.
I think the best advice is you start with the program you really want to enroll in. I mean, honestly, I think that, and if that's the more selective program, then that's what you should do. I know in the UC system in California, they give exactly that advice, is always lead with the more highly impacted or restricted major first, because that's the one that you most, if it's the one you most want to go to. I just think that the question for second choice is you have to really look at how the college asks that questions and what they have to offer, because there may be a kind of stepping stone to get into that more selective major, or it could be a situation where if you're not admitted to that most selective major, you're never going to be admitted to that. So that's a good question to ask of an admissions counselor. You know, that's a very legitimate question to reach out to your admission counselor and say, here's what I'm struggling with. You know, here's my background, here are my interests, here's what I'm thinking about doing. Am I looking at this the right way?
Yeah, and I would say my advice around program choice is understanding whether or not you can switch into a program later on in the duration, right? So like, for example, at the University of Washington, that is something where like, if you don't get into computer science from the beginning, transferring it is nearly impossible. You have to do like a whole petition case and go through a lot of hoops and jumps because the major is already so impacted. A lot of the UCs, University of California system, it's a similar approach. So again, you're going to want to do your research and ask. That's a great question to ask your regional admissions officer is, hey, I'm interested in this area. You know, is this something that, you know, you have to get in right from the beginning, or, you know, is there a flexibility? And you can say like, I'm interested in it, but I haven't quite made up my mind yet, right? You don't have to say like, this is exactly what I want for the rest of my life. Because oftentimes people don't actually know that, right? So I would definitely clarify whether or not it's possible to do the program later on in your duration. But at many schools, they will have an open policy around you can have your first 2 years to explore, and then you can transfer into a major later on. So I think clarifying the distinction from, is this a program first school, like University of Illinois is probably going to be one where you want to do that, University of Washington, other schools, or is this something that like I can possibly move into if I decide it's something I still want to do later on? So let's see. Another question that came up was, how do colleges use outside admissions essay readers to integrate with the admissions reader? That is a good question. At most schools, and Susan can speak to this very directly because she is an outside reader. A lot of colleges, especially right now, because the application volume far surpasses what their like full-time staff are able to complete in a timely manner and give enough time and attention, which is wild because again, it's very limited time and attention. And that's even with the outside readers added into the queue, right? So in terms of kind of like the difference there, the outside readers receive the same training, the same rubric, like they go through kind of like, for example, at Pomona, we had outside readers, they were involved in kind of every step of our reading training and process. And because we did a team reading process, 2 admissions readers reading the same file at the same time, the outside reader was typically paired with someone who reads full-time or is a full-time staff member at the college. So every college approaches this differently. For example, the University of California system has hundreds of outside readers who are evaluating candidacies. And they don't have a team reading process where 2 admissions readers are reading the same file. So every college's reading process is different depending on the volume of applications, their capacity, just their kind of approach and openness to outside readers. Susan, I don't know if you wanted to kind of add anything to that based on actually doing that.
Well, you know, outside readers, universities use them in 2 ways. If a university is committee-based evaluation, then you're reading in tandem with a full-time member of the staff. And the staff member does the academic evaluation, the outside reader does the personal evaluation, and then the 2 are meshed together, discussed, and ratings assigned. So there's some checks and balances there, which really is very effective. It's a slower, more thorough process, but it also eliminates a round of reading that would occur later on that generally then doesn't need to happen because of the two readers at that time. But one university I read at, I was just a first reader and I read all by myself. I read the whole application. I had a rubric of ratings I assigned. I recalculated the grade point average. I added up and gave a rigor assignment, rigor rating for the student's record. And basically I was preparing the application to then go on to the regional reader who would be looking at applicants from a geographic region by high school, or if not by high school, by a region, because that would be the person who was the recruiter for that area. So the colleges use outside readers in different ways. We generally do not sit in committee, although this year I was invited to read on a scholarship committee for my university. So they kept a couple of us on to sit on scholarship committees for kids who'd already passed through to the acceptance point, and then they were merit scholar applicants in the arts. And I stayed and did that, which was a lot of fun.
Yeah.
But I never really find out what happens in the end. And after having been in admissions for a dozen years, where I saw my geographic territories, when I was at Bates, I had the entire state of Connecticut, all of Metro New York, and a bunch of other random states. And I saw those applicants from, prospective student through enrolling student. But then that was a full-time position. And now I'm a kind of a fill-in.
Yeah. So actually, there were two questions that came in about the theme of reapplying. So two students that they were not super satisfied with their admissions process this past cycle, and that they just opted to take a gap year to focus on other things, which I'm a huge proponent of gap years for anyone, regardless of if you had a quote unquote successful admissions process or not. I think anyone who is a current student who is just feeling burnt out by college or by high school, a gap year can be an incredible opportunity to recharge yourself, just have a different environment, be outside of a formal classroom setting, and really kind of dig deep into your interests. So huge fan of gap years all around. And there's a lot of ways to do them that don't cost a lot of money too. That's something that people are like, oh, you need a lot of money to travel, this and that. You can do homestay programs or WOOF like I did, which is where you literally, it's called Willing Workers on Organic Farms. And I did this in Australia. You stay for free, in a place, and you do work for them, and they provide you with meals and housing. And granted, all I ate was mangoes and rice. So I was so stick thin by the end of it, but it was a really incredible cultural immersion. Anyway, zooming out from the gap year, the advice is basically about reapplying to schools that you applied to previously and what you kind of do to make yourself competitive for that. So I actually have an anecdote related to this. I had a student who I was actually really intrigued by when I was a Pomona reader from Washington State. She attended Ingram High School. Shout out to anyone who may be tuning in from Ingram. And her candidacy in the beginning, there was a lot that you could kind of tell she wasn't quite ready for college. Even though there was things that were compelling about her, there were just not enough institutional priorities to push her forward. And there was a little bit of kind of just shakiness in the way that she was writing about her direction on life and where she was headed. And then the second time around when she applied and she reapplied, her academic majors and interests had shifted based on real life experiences that she dug into during her gap year. And she was really clear in her second application of not just reusing all her same materials as before, but really highlighting a lot about what she did during that year and how it had solidified interests that she had. She talked a lot about, in particular, political advocacy, advocacy for LGBTQ individuals. She gave an experience about phone banking and kind of empathy conversations that she had with voters from different political beliefs. So there was just a lot more life experience and kind of new information that she was kind of sending in as part of her candidacy. So to those two students who were disappointed by your outcomes, I would say the biggest thing that I would recommend that you do is kind of really use the application process, especially if you're going to be a reapply to schools you've applied to before. They will still have that application on file. So you don't want to just reuse the same application and just submit again. There needs to be something new in the mix. And in terms of reaching out to them to be what went wrong, you can try, but I almost can guarantee you that they're not really going to give you a lot of detail as to why you weren't admitted. College admissions officers are not really given the kind of green light to be so upfront about, here are things that were noted in your admissions file and in the notes from why you weren't admitted. But it definitely doesn't hurt to reach out to be hey, I want to be more competitive this time around. Do you have any tips, anything that you think that I should be thinking about? The admissions officer might give you some hints that they maybe feel compelled to share, or they might be a little more tight-lipped depending on the culture of their admissions office and what they've been trained to do. So it's hard for you to know as an applicant which route they're going to go or how much information they'll provide to you. But and again, it doesn't hurt to reach out. And in fact, it shows that you're proactively thinking about seeking that place again, and you're trying to carve out a course of action that makes you as competitive as possible.
Yeah.
Another question we got was, I'm trying to reconcile two seemingly contradictory statements. This is a great one, Susan, and I think you are.
Yeah, I thought this was a good question.
Oh, so good. So I'm just going to paste it in the chat so that way folks who didn't see it earlier can see it. But this is the question here. So Susan, any thoughts on this question around context about your high school? And what if you go to a high performing high school that has a lot of like high average test scores listed on the school profile and you don't submit them?
I have really strong feelings about this issue because I think sometimes college admissions people give kind of contradictory responses to their feelings about test optional. But here's my answer. Admissions people never second guess. It's not their job. Their job is to use what information is in the student's application to make an appropriate decision. So, you know, if one student who's at a well-resourced high school where everybody else seems to test fairly well and they choose not to submit their scores, it could be because they have a learning difference. They might have another reason for under testing. And they prefer to stand on the strength of their other credentials. And test optional admissions, and obviously test blind admissions, is a vote of confidence that kids and families can make the right decision for themselves, and should do that confidently without fear of anybody second guessing. Even if a student goes to a well-resourced high school where everyone's paying thousands of dollars for test prep, it is not a reflection on the student who does not submit. And I think you've got to have some faith in the process. It would be very disingenuous of admissions people to speculate as to why a student did or did not submit scores. They're simply not in the file. I was looking today at a lot of highly selective schools. I had a bunch of common data sets with a student because he was all freaked out about his ACT scores, and he's prepping over the summer, and he's wants to improve his. So I finally made him tell me what his scores were from the spring of his junior year, because he didn't even write that on my questionnaire. And from my perspective, the gap between his initial scores and where he's going to need to be, as in around the median, the middle 50% on the common data set, it's too far. And I said, are there any reasons why you think you really undertested on that date? I didn't take a class. But I know enough about this young man to guess that this would not be a good use of his time. There are parts of the application that he can really work on now that will elevate his application and make him a stronger candidate. And trying to get his scores up, his ACT up a few points, maybe it's going to be possible and maybe it won't, but I don't think he's going to be close enough to the midpoint of the range for him to put that kind of effort. I think it's a waste of his time.
Yeah, and some of my biggest talking points around this topic, both Susan and I are very passionate about this. On our webinar, or our podcast that we recorded about like academic courses, we had like a whole section about test optional, and it was like an hour. So anyway, I always tell students and families, this is the single most part of the admissions process that students and families think people on the other end care so much about. And the reality is, mathematically, high scores are a dime a dozen in these application pools. They don't really distinguish kids that many. It just shows that you're consistent. And not having it, actually, there were many students that I would have. Holy Cross was always test optional, so I was used to reading in a test optional way. And then I transitioned to working at Pomona, and I would have kids who they would have all the institutional priorities that the college was telling me that they wanted in a student, but then they had lower scores and a few other things that basically was like, oh, well, the scores are really soft, so we can't admit them. And I'm like, if the scores weren't here, you would be admitting the student with flying colors because they have all the other things that you're asking for. So in fact, admissions offices generally, I'd say, especially, of course, there's kind of like a learning curve and an adjustment period with the influx of applications. Doesn't necessarily mean that that's an influx of high quality applications. That's one thing that I always tell students and families to keep in mind. It's people think that the scores were the thing that was keeping them out of the running, when in fact, generally that wasn't the thing or only thing that made their application less competitive. So we actually did a study at Pomona to train ourselves with this new reading process where we read, some of us on the team read files with test scores and some read them without. And we all gave the exact same admissions recommendations for every single kid in this test. So it kind of just proved what we already knew, which is that the scores were not the thing that we went to in the beginning to like, see whether or not a student was competitive. And for the point about average scores related to a school context where if you're not submitting and the kids at the school all have high test scores, does that mean that the admissions officer is going to be playing Nancy Drew and just guessing that you did poorly? They're not even going to spend any time talking about it. They're going through this so quickly that they just are basing their info on what they have. And a lot of the admissions officers are actually not really huge fans of standardized testing. It's more the board and the president and people who are concerned about the outside appearance of the school and how good it is, because the public oftentimes associates quality with high test scores, and that leads to more application volumes, which at an era where many schools that don't have those high volumes are going to have to shut down in the next 10 to 20 years, not to get all like Grim Reaper, but schools are obviously interested in keeping those score ranges high because those are going to guarantee more public attention, more eyes on them, and a higher application volume to keep them viable. So I think scores are actually a lot more of a business piece of the college's operational world as opposed to their academic credentials, because there is study after study that Susan herself has been a part of that have really proven time and time again that first year performance and performance in college in general is much more tied to your academic record and not to your test scores. So it's just something to keep in mind. I think we have time for one more question. Which is how long this is a quick one. How long do applications stay on file? It depends on the school, but I would say in general, I know at Pomona, I think there were things in the system slate that we used from the past like 5-6 years. And sometimes they might do like a data cleanup or something along those lines, but it will depend on the college as to how long a file is kept on record. You can ask them if they have a record of it and they can let you know, but I'd say a couple of years usually.
And there are some colleges that they're gone immediately.
Yeah.
They're gone. And I won't get into FERPA here, but one of the reasons, if a college holds on to application materials, then a student who enrolls at that school technically then can go in and request to see their own application, which never really makes that much sense to me. But there, you can see in Common App, actually, there's a reference page that lets you know whether or not recommendations are held onto by an institution. And it's surprisingly a very small number. I think the trend is for applications to pretty much be deleted and not held. There may be some federal legislation around that because of some lawsuits in the last year or so, but I haven't heard any resolutions.
There's just a quick question from Joshua that I was typing out, but it's quicker for me to say it. What happens if I send my test scores automatically, but the test scores end up being bad? In general, most schools are now allowing you to self-report your test scores. So I personally actually wouldn't recommend, if you take a test and there's an option to like, oh, send your scores to these schools for free when they're available right away, I actually wouldn't fill that out. You can choose to send them on later on if you want. And there's fee waivers if the cost of sending them in is a barrier for your particular situation. But because most schools are allowing you to self-report your test scores as part of your application, I actually would just recommend doing that. So that way you have complete control over which schools get scores and which schools don't. Because at some schools you apply to, your scores might be a lot towards the higher end of their averages, and at others, they may not be as competitive. So that will be something that you'll want to make as a decision on a case-by-case basis, and just doing the self-reported route gives you a lot more control. But if you do already, you can email the admissions rep for your regional area and be like, I would like to be considered as a test optional applicant. Please let me know if you'd like any information from me. Thank you for your time. You can be very brief, and that's all you need to let them know to have your status change in their system.
Yeah, on your Common App or Coalition App supplement, you'll be asked the question about whether or not you would like your scores considered. If you check no on that, then the scores that you sent in should not then be imported into your file. But I would do exactly what Tom recommended and get in touch with your counselor and just make sure that's going to happen. It happens.
And you can also like CC or add on the email too, just the general admissions email, just so that way you know that if your individual admissions officer doesn't get back to you, doesn't mean that they didn't change the status, but sometimes it's nice to have like, a lot of times there's an administrative assistant team that looks over all those, communications, and it just makes sure that whoever is supposed to make that change will have it, be filtered in the system to get to them. So that's another tip, pro tip. The last question I wanted to touch on was Krista's, and it was basically about what do you do when like you are comparing yourself to students from your school who have higher GPA or more impressive classes and test scores, but you might be an applicant who's really shown a lot of touch points with schools that you're interested in and, might have other compelling things that you're bringing forward to the table. I actually have an anecdote exactly about this. So I used to work at a very high performing high school where the average test scores were very high. I had a lot of questions similar to the questions that you all have today on this webinar around, if I don't send in my scores, are the admissions officers going to think that mine were bad because the average for, the high school is so high, all these types of things. And I had this one applicant who I was like, he is like the king of like knowing this process because he reached out to all the admissions reps at all the schools he was interested in. He had done such deep research, followed them on social media, visited their campuses, did overnight visits, made very compelling case for himself in terms of what he was bringing to the table, his values, all these things, all the things that we kind of mentioned from a counseling standpoint, he was really factoring into his process. I will say, admittedly, he kind of, I think, was like having it dominate a lot of his senior year. So that's just something in terms of like carving out time to be that intentional applicant is something that you really want to be aware of. I would say if he maybe applied to like 2-3 less schools, that probably would have been an ideal scenario. But regardless, he ended up being admitted to so many more of these selective colleges than the peers. And he was so concerned because he was lower in the school group. He was still competitive academically. He still had A's. He still had challenging courses, but he was not this like rock star academic student in the grand scheme of the pool. But he was admitted to all these selective schools that peers of his with these far superior academic credentials were not. And he was just an example for me of something that I know very well from reading lots of applications over the years. And I know Susan does too, of, academics being a foot in the door. And kind of back to my point about like mooring yourself, like just adding more and more and more and being 0.20 points higher in the GPA scale from students from your school. Those are things that people will be talking about in the admission side, and it's good to be not naive about that. But also, I think if you kind of get your foot in the door at these schools from your academic record, which, if you are kind of like I said before, you have mostly A's, you've taken about over half of the advanced courses ish. That's a very loose suggestion of the advanced courses that your high school offers. Like, you're in the running academically for these highly selective schools. Doesn't mean that you are a shoo-in, but it means that some of these other touch points of showing vulnerability, heart, humanity, different values that may not be as explained through your activities and whatnot, those are things that definitely can be really beneficial to your candidacy and don't go unnoticed in this current landscape. So any last parting words, Susan, for our audience? I know I'm actually shocked that we still have 78 people here.
I'm very impressed. Thank you for hanging in with us. No, I think folks will get the recording, right, Tom? And will they get a copy of your PowerPoint? Your PowerPoint. How old am I?
Google Slides, but
slide deck.
Yeah. We don't share copies of slides typically for most college essay guide presentations, but you will be getting an email with show notes, and any of the links that we shared in the presentation will be included in that particular summary email. But I also really recommend, if you are interested in this topic, really recommend the highly selective course. Like, I talk a lot about these things in a lot more detail. Each session is an hour and a half. We do a case study where we have like all these different admissions files, and we have to admit one, waitlist one, and deny one. So you really get a sense a lot more of like the admissions officer's brain and what they're tasked to do as part of their job. So I highly recommend taking it. It's also a pay what you can course, just like almost all the things at College Essay Guy. So don't look at the sticker price and think that you can't, afford taking the class. You can submit that pay what you can request and participate. So thanks again, everyone, for tuning in. and really wishing you the best of luck. Continue to stay engaged with College Essay Guy. We'll be having more webinars and podcasts and YouTube videos and this and that going forward. So yeah, ease, purpose, and joy. We're sending it through our bandwidth, our wavelength, or whatever. What's the cringiest thing you've did this week and this webinar? So sounds good. Thanks,
Thank you,
everyone.
friends.
Bye.